notes, but I remember when he took off Sunday morning and he left his wife at church. We've been talking about the past, and we're going to sing about the future. Let's see if I can remember this verse. And behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead in Christ shall rise, and we shall all be changed. And isn't that going to be wonderful to see all those relatives once again? This is a spiritual in the great getting up morning. I'm going to tell you about the coming of the judgment. Fare thee well, fare thee well. I'm going to tell you about the coming of the judgment. Fare thee well, fare thee well. There's a better day a-coming. Fare thee well, fare thee well. There's a better day a-coming. Fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. When you see the lightning flashing, fare thee well, fare thee well. Then you'll hear the thunder crashing, fare thee well, fare thee well. When you see the stars a-falling, fare thee well, fare thee well. Hear old Gabriel's trumpet calling, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. When you see the lightning flashing, then you'll hear the thunder crashing. When you see the stars a-falling, then you'll hear the chariots coming. Good news, chariots are coming. Good news, chariots are coming. Good news, chariots are coming, and I don't want to be left out. There's a long white robe in the heaven I know. Long white robe in the heaven I know. Long white robe in the heaven I know. Good news, chariots are coming. Good news, chariots are coming. So glad chariots are coming, and I don't want to be left out. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, my brother. Great getting up morning, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. In that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well, fare thee well. I have to say it's been quite an entertaining afternoon, hasn't it? P.R. Kaufman. Actually, if I was really P.R. Kaufman, I'd be 150 years old today. But it's been nice that somebody has mentioned that Anna Kaufman was his favorite Sunday school teacher, and that would happen to be one of my daughters. My actual name is Peter Robert Kaufman. And when you come to America, it probably didn't have the same connotation that it did in Germany. Because my middle name was Robert, and when I came to America, they like to call me Peter Rabbit Kaufman. So I just took the initials. It sounded a lot more professional. P.R. Kaufman. When I was 9 years old, our family migrated to America, and as 9-year-old, I'm sure that we didn't have any idea what was all involved in this. We were just a bunch of kids running around goofing off. But there had been a lot of preparation done over the last several years. Johann Waltner and Peter Gehring, they'd made
numerous trips to Bavaria and Warsaw among the Lutherans and different Jews, trying to get them to come to Bohemia and buy out a number of villages where we left. And so that is what happened. And then later on, after they bought out a lot of our stuff, then we had to have a great big sale. And of course the supply was a lot greater than the demand. And so there was a lot of people shedding a lot of tears because a lot of the stuff that they were selling was just basically giving it away. But then you got to remember, at that time it was kind of a bartering system at that time. Money was not used like it is today. You bartered for a lot of things, and so it just wasn't as common. So that was the reason there was a lot of tears shed when our ancestors left to Germany. You know, seems like our ancestors, everywhere they went, they were only there about 50 years and they had to leave. So we here in America really ought to feel grateful. We've been here a lot more than 50 years. Anyway, as one old fellow came along, he said, "Well, I wish you Godspeed on this foolhardy adventure. I'm sure that either the Indians will scalp you and eat you, or your ship will sink." He really gave us a lot of courage to go on. But we left home and we walked along because our fathers, we didn't know what a railroad was, and they didn't know what a railroad was either. They never seen a train at all. So we walked and we walked till we came to some train tracks, and then we just followed them, and us boys would run along, and we seen these poles, and we heard they were telegraph poles. We went and we put our ear up against the poles, and we heard them buzzing, and we looked up at the wires, and we thought we would surely see a message, but we never did see a message. We finally got to a train depot, and we waited for the train to get there. And of course, the train was something that none of us had ever seen, and when it got there, it was big and it made a lot of noise and a lot of smoke. And we had unhitched the horses, of course, but when the train got there, it blew this smoke all over and air, and it scared the horses and they took off. It was a disaster. But anyway, we finally got through Austria into Germany and landed in Hamburg, and there we had to stay till we could go to Hull in England. And it was that time that the women were really impressed by what the cooks were feeding us. So they went down to the where the cooks were working, and they found out that they'd been feeding us horse meat. We went and told the congregation, and some of them said, "Well, it's a sin to eat horse meat." And some said, "Well, a horse is sure a lot cleaner than a pig, and we haven't died yet." Well, before we boarded the boat then, there was a peddler that came along with some anti-seasickness medicine. And our fathers had never been on a boat, so they thought, well, we better be sure and get some. So they bought one bottle of rum, one bottle of raspberry vinegar, and a small bottle of anti-seasickness drops. Accordingly, when we got on the ships, we were all in good spirits. We landed at Hull, and from there we took a train to Liverpool to the ship, the city of Richmond, and then to New York to Castle Garden, the place where all immigrants went at that time. And that was when we redeemed our rubles for dollars. We found out our rubles were only 73 cents compared to $1. So even though we hadn't got very much for our goods, when we sold them in Russia, we were 25 cents less than we thought we had. Anyway, we loaded the train and headed west. It was August and everything was green. Miles and miles, how the scenery changed as we got closer and closer to our destination. The fewer the population. At last we arrived in Peabody. The Santa Fe Railroad provided a place to stay until we could secure our own property. Of course, that was quite a place. The immigrant house was 14 by 120 foot long. And the floor was our bed. And all in the house prepared their meals on one stove. No table or chairs were there. Our dad soon built some benches, and then the fathers went to look for some good fertile land that awaited this industrious people. However, no sooner had they left than I think it was 12 children got sick and died. My father and brother-in-law bought a yoke of young oxen. The oxen did not understand German. Did not understand German. So Dad took a stick and he laid it up on their back. And they took off. And they never stopped for about a mile. And Dad finally caught up to them. They wouldn't move until a good American came along and talked some good profane English to them. Then they turned around and walked back to town. Oxen were a lot cheaper than horses, about $4 compared to 30 or 40 for a good horse. And they were about half as fast as a horse. And when working with an oxen, if they would happen to get thirsty and they could smell water, they would take off. And you better just get out of your way, because they were going to go to the creek or the pond, and they would stand right in the middle with the plow or the wagon, whatever had been on behind of them. And then it was a challenge to get them out of the water. In Russia, we had to do business with Jews, and that was not all bad, because the Jews, they were the seamstresses, and they did a lot of the making of the clothes that we wore. But they usually asked 2 or 3 times more than what they would actually take for a product. When we came to America, we thought that was just kind of the normal way of doing business. But our father soon found out that the Englishmen were sometimes quite offended at that, and sometimes called us Jews. The last thing Dad had to sell was a ram. And 2 Jews came over to look at this ram. One, Dad told him how much he wanted for the ram. And this one Jew, he got into the pen. He checked his teeth and he checked his feet. He examined his wool. He said, "How much did you want for that ram?" And Dad said, "So much it was." And he said, "I'll take him. He's a fine specimen." So he turned around and went over to look at some other sheep on the other side of the fence. And I could tell that the ram was getting a little antsy-pantsy of this guy handling him all over. So when this guy bent over to check these other sheep, the ram went head first right into his rear end, and over the fence he went. The Jew got up, he said, "You didn't tell me he was a butter." "But I'll take him. I said I'd take him, and he's a fine specimen. I'll take him." I figured he'd try to Jew Dad down a little bit on that deal. Anyway, we went to Peabody, to Halstead, then to Mound Ridge on railroad ground. We started farming with 12 farmers. The grass, of course, was buffalo and blue stem, and the buffalo grass was really hard to plow. It took 4 or 5 horses pulling a 12-foot plow, 12-inch plow blade, and it took at least 4 guys holding on to the plow and 1 guy holding on to the horses, getting the horses to go, because it was tough plowing. And I was really glad that I was only 9 years old. I just had to watch. But it was real hard work. Thrashing was the harvesting the grain. The first year was pretty much non-existent. Our first year was a crop failure. But what was harvested had to be cut with a scythe, and there was no twine or anything to tie the sheaves together. You had to braid your stalks together and then wrap them around to make a bundle. It was all hard work. And I was very fortunate, like I said. My main job was just to watch the cattle that they didn't get too far out of sight. But we drew numbers out of a hat where you were going to live, and my dad chose section 23, and he was real happy with that. But when he came back from Topeka, he got section 28, and he was real upset with that, and he didn't know what to do. And Mom said, "Why don't we move to Dakotas?" My older brother had left for Dakota several years before, and he was living in Dakota. And Mom had always wanted the family to stay together. But Dad said, "Okay, we'll draw out, we'll take names on a piece of paper, Kansas or Dakota, we'll put them in a hat, and you draw. What you draw is where we'll stay." And so she closed her eyes and drew, and it was Kansas. So we stayed in Kansas. Dad had already gone through all the work of breaking out the sod and tilling the soil and planting the crop. And he didn't want to have to go to Dakota, where we would have to wait another course of time before we had any income at all. And so, anyway, things got better after the first 2 years. And when I was 17, I went to work cutting broom corn. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with broom corn. We don't have broom corn anymore, but broom corn is quite a crop. It grows 7 to 10 feet tall, and to handle them bundles, it took quite a man. And we made a whole sum of $1.25 a day. That was pretty good money at that time, but boy, you really worked for it. When I was 24 then, I left home to see some of the things that I'd read about in books, and I went to Raton, New Mexico. It was there that I saw the beautiful landscape, but I also saw the sinfulness of man and how they didn't have any regard for God or anything spiritual. I came home. I'd had my belly full of the sinfulness of man. I came home and got married to Anna Stuckey. And then later on we got a claim in Oklahoma. And then later on, I moved back to Belmont, and the home is still about 10 miles southeast of here. If you really want to see it, you can still see it. But I'm real proud of my children. I had 9 children, and 5 of them were school teachers. And as already been mentioned, Anna was a real great Sunday school teacher. She led a lot of kids to the Lord. Thank you very much.